Zach Quintero, who is running for New Mexico State Auditor. Val, take it away.
Well, thank you. This is kind of a special edition, Thursday edition, and lately we've kind of bounced around. I know we had planned to do an interview with Sandy Hammock, and that would have been the fourth candidate for a new House representative seat. She was unable to make it today, but she promised that she'll try to reschedule. So we're excited about having that. But instead, we got a statewide race for state auditor, and Zach Quintero is with us. But before I start, I just want to take a moment to remember and recognize the tragedy that happened near San Antonio, Texas, at the elementary school, Roy Elementary School, I think it's called. Rob Elementary School. Um, and the shooting, an 18-year-old was upset, shot his grandmother, got in the vehicle, wrecked the vehicle, went into the school, took hostage of a classroom, and shot, I think, almost every student. A couple teachers died, and I believe 18 students?
19 students.
19 students. So to me, that's terrible. And I was thinking back in the 90s when Columbine happened, it was such a huge thing. This kind of stuff doesn't happen, but now it's almost like we treat it, oh, another shooting.
Well, it's difficult because as we started, before we went live on this, we were talking about, we accidentally mentioned the wrong school, and we were all asking ourselves, has there been another shooting?
Yeah.
I mean, it's been so common that we don't know from moment to moment if there's actually been another shooting, and that really is a problem.
And I noticed that somebody put a list of all the shootings from Columbine to today on Facebook, and I was scrolling down through that, and I think there must have been over 200 places, schools, and different places on there.
Well,
I think I'd like to ask Zach a little bit. I know he's been an advocate for different issues in New Mexico, both statewide and nationally, about the shooting. Zach, do you have any comments?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for both hosting me today, and I want to make sure my levels are good. Y'all can hear me just fine. And
I think we're good.
my name is Zachary Quintero. I'm a son of Southern New Mexico, and I'm running for state auditor. But this specific, tragedy and this specific harm that we're doing, that we've seen happen in Uvalde, this is a 90% Latino school.
Mm.
This is a school near the border that is a tight-knit community that is a lot in many ways, like Socorro, like
Absolutely.
Mesilla, like Hatch, where everybody knows each other at the grocery store, where everybody knows each other at the high school. And I can't imagine the pain and soul tearing that is happening to the parents right now. But I pray for them, and I also follow up with prayer is not enough. What we are going to need is designated action and responsibility and accountability from across the state, from across the country. And it overlaps with our office and making sure, the emergency restriction protection orders are enforced when it comes to keeping guns out of the hands of folks that aren't in the best frame of mind or that are seeking to do harm to themselves or the community. Making sure we don't have a backlog of cases like that, auditing that, and having accountability will be a huge part of this office. But my heart breaks for these children and their families, because right now as we speak, family members are having to go into the crime scene right now because the bodies of these children are so mangled from the shots that they were hit with, from the bullet rounds. They can't identify the kids.
Yep.
They can't identify the kids. And I want you to think about that for a second. How did we get to a point where somebody could easily get a weapon of war so quickly, have a bad day, and then just go into a school and create this kind of carnage? It takes time for something like that to happen, and it takes us to be okay with it. So that has to stop right now.
And I know you mentioned a couple of things there that I'd like to follow up on. There's some information coming out because I tried to keep up with this. Is this young man, 18 years old, was encountered by the security guard. But I don't know if the security guard was not armed or what. He was able to get past the security guard and then into the classroom. I don't know if there was any gunfire between the two or not, but that initial security failed.
Exactly.
So that was not enough. Now you also mentioned guns, and you mentioned the mental health of a shooter, a potential shooter.
Yeah.
And I think those are the two key items here. And we've said this before. When I was in high school, I remember this vividly. You could go to the parking lot, and the high school's just right around the corner here, and there would be shotguns, there'd be 22s, there'd be on all the gun racks in all the trucks.
Right.
And nobody called. They didn't shut down the school or call SWAT or nothing.
Right.
Because after school, if it was in the fall or November, we were going to go rabbit hunting or go shoot some dove or
Right.
something. So it was accepted, and it was the way it is. But nowadays, if there was a gun seen anywhere in a vehicle, man, that's it. We're
Right.
sitting down. We're calling the authorities and stuff. So things have drastically changed it's been 40 years since I've been in school, but what are issues with guns? Because you hear that debate back and forth. Well, it's not guns, and I think it is a little bit guns. We need to do something about guns.
There's a balance, I think, and I feel it's a combination of a two-pronged approach. The first is accessibility and the ease of getting access to a high-capacity weapon that can do massive damage. You're not hunting with an AR-15. I grew up with hunters.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Unit 34. I know what that specific lifestyle is like, where you're eating, where you're hunting to eat food.
Yeah.
You do not need a semi-automatic weapon to get that shot, to go out and be able to get that kind of game.
Yeah. And most hunting guns have a magazine of about 3 or 4 rounds.
Exactly. That's it.
So you get 3 shots at a deer and then it's gone.
Yeah.
But an AR-14 or an automatic weapon can have 300 rounds.
Exactly.
And shoot those in a matter of seconds.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
and the in-between reloading time too, Val.
Yeah.
That's the big part here. So I want to stress this. One thing nationally that's happening is maybe getting the gun manufacturers to have weapons that are created where they don't use high-capacity rounds, where it's very cumbersome to reload shot after shot after shot. Otherwise, you're literally getting a military weapon in the streets or in a school or in a church.
So when we talk about this and gun owners, the typical hunting rifle is a tool.
Mm-hmm.
And the automatic weapon like an AR-14 is more of a toy, in that we want to go out and see how fast we can tear down that tree. And then they get a rush out of it, and they want to be able to do that.
Sure.
But the in the hands of somebody that has some mental issues or no regard for life,
Right.
then that becomes dangerous, extremely
Completely.
dangerous.
Very much so. And the two-pronged approach, we talked about the gun side. Let's talk about the mental health side. For the folks that are saying, we need to make the investments in mental health, I challenge anyone from that argument. I haven't seen the right, or Republicans for that matter, openly push for mental health funding, for ADA funding, for anything related towards public investments in healthcare to help stop any of these kinds of issues that they claim to care about.
Yep.
We got to take that serious if we're talking about accountability. We need to make the investments of being able to be there for our kids, for our community, and anybody who's struggling with a difficult moment in mental health.
Go ahead, Reese.
Yeah, well, just put a couple of background to you. Ex-military U.S. Army and fired the AR-15 itself. And again, we're talking about laying down fire in a combat situation where that multiple round is important to prevent people from moving. That's why you have those high-capacity rounds. First thing also, I had an article published when Columbine happened back in the day, because what a lot of people don't understand is that after World War II and debriefing the soldiers from World War II, we found out that soldiers hesitated to fire on other human beings. There was a psychological hesitancy that took place. Prior to World War II, All soldiers and police were trained with round targets. They were trained with round targets. That training changed based on debriefing the soldiers after World War II to the human silhouette, which is now a standard target practice for police officers and military. Now, when we consider our kids with 3D immersive first person shooter games, if a round to a silhouette target can reduce psychological hesitancy, which was found to be true in both the Korean and the Vietnam War that followed, think about the first person shooter games that are out there right now. Secondly, when you talk about security and getting around security, we've also had reports from our first responders who've been in these schools, have been at these events, and they have found that the shooters are not the classical shooter. The classical untrained shooter, typically with a weapon, will unload on one person. They will unload on one person. And what they found is trained shooters who shoot a target, move to the next target, shoot to another target, move to a target. One of these kids that you talked about was shot in the nose, according to one first-person description, okay? So you think about that. We changed from round targets to human silhouette targets to reduce the psychological hesitancy to fire on another human being. We changed our police and our military to do that. Now our kids are playing these first-person shooter games, and they're taking that training into these classrooms, especially with the psychological, with the different drugs. We've seen a lot of that with some of the drug therapy that kids are on at times. So we've got an issue. We definitely got an issue with our psychology and what kids are being exposed to, and the medications that they're on. But again, I agree with each of you. The AR-15 is an assault weapon. It's designed for rapid fire to prevent people from moving in a combat situation. That's not needed for hunting. That's not needed for home safety.
Right. And
Yeah.
go ahead. No.
Go ahead, Zach.
No, so I think there's a holistic approach we can look at this from, and I want to make sure we emphasize again a lot of the debate that we've seen time and time again. I don't hide that I'm a Democrat. I don't hide that I'm a proud son of Southern New Mexico that grew up around guns, but responsible gun owners that were Democrats as well. But here's the follow-up with that. The Second Amendment folks that yell out there, it's our freedom. Well, read the full context of the law. It says well-regulated militia. Regulated. I'm a graduate of UNM School of Law. I had to study the Constitution. Okay? I know what I'm talking about here. Regulated militia means making sure that you don't have capacity to get access to military-grade weapons or an F-16 if you wanted it, right? Just because you might be afraid of an existential threat. You need to be able to have these checks and balances in place from state and federal governments while respecting, safe storage, while making sure people understand the full context and dangerous. I liken it to what my grandpa taught me. That's a live rattlesnake in your hand. Yep. And you got to treat it that way.
Yep.
And you always have to be able to be ready to know that that weapon can discharge at any given moment, which means you have a duty to protect everybody around you to be safe and distant from that, not encourage folks to be around that or go seeking a problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, and then Zach, you mentioned something that I think is important to echo is medical access to medical, including mental health.
Yes.
And in rural New Mexico, we find that to be, everybody that's come on this show that we've talked about and asked about medical insurance, medical health care, mental health, they all agree that in Socorro County, it's greatly needed. And I think one of the things is like for instance, psychiatrists in Socorro. I think there's one psychiatrist in Socorro, and in schools we have over 1,000 kids.
Yep.
So how functional is that ratio right now?
Not functional at all. And it's something, again, this is where we need to prioritize. If we're serious about mental health, we're talking about the public's health. And we're talking about our kids in our schools and getting mental health resource counselors to our schools and providing the funding dedicated to do that so we can catch issues early on and be there as a community of support rather than have a day like what happened just recent.
Yeah.
So many times folks find themselves in different situations and we don't know the struggles that people are facing one-on-one internally and at home. But what we can do is make sure we have the best support system humanly possible, because the alternative is what we're looking at right now. The alternative is what we're facing right now.
And is it hitting in New Mexico? Well, absolutely it is. just the other day at a gas station, a a car full of young people drove up to another car, misidentified the driver as somebody causing problems with them, and they killed the lady with their kids in the vehicle. So stuff like that is happening here. We see shootings going on, and senseless shootings like that where it's just we're gonna go retaliate because you disrespected me or you called me something, and I think that goes back to these shooter games that you can get, and then they put warnings on the games, but they still sell them to whoever wants to buy them. You go to Walmart and you look at the list, you go through all the games, you see all the different shooter games, the combat games, the I don't want to mention any names because I just don't, but they have access to that lifestyle in a game, and let's face it, so many of our kids live much of their life in cyberspace anymore.
Sure, there's the overlap between the digital reality and the physical reality, for
Yep.
sure, that you're talking about. What I have seen in my experience is the training starts on day one at home. If you're a gun owner with somebody, with a family that has a background of either hunting or anything like that, the kids that are out there trying to shoot somebody for no reason and acting emotional with a firearm in their hand, I feel is because they're getting accessibility to those guns at home. They're not safely stored, right? Number one. Number two, we're not catching the issues of the mental health issues that you're talking about early on, right? And number three, they might be able to get it from somebody's pickup truck without the other person knowing, right?
Yep.
Or they might go and try to 3D print a gun. That's a new thing that we're talking about.
Yep.
Ghost guns now.
Ghost guns.
So having those kinds of regulations in place and protections and investments in public health is going to get us out of this. But that's the approach we got to have, a multi-pronged approach.
And I'll end with this little story. I lived and grew up just down the little hill from here. In fact, my mom still lives there. I had a good friend that lived down the street from me, and we both had air rifles,
Yeah.
pellet guns. So we'd get our pellet guns and we'd hit all these llanos here. And my friend Anthony had a dog named Sam, and he'd snip out the lizards, and then we'd hunt them down. And we had a tree full of lizards. His mom got mad at us for dragging all these lizards home. But one time we shot towards the house, and I think the BB bounced off a rock and broke a window's neighbor. And my friend's dad found out about it. He took those air rifles away from us
Immediately.
because we were not conscious of the direction we were firing, and we were shooting back to the neighborhoods. Nobody got hurt, but he said somebody could have been standing there,
Right.
and you shouldn't have done that. And those kind of things are part of that learning process, where you're pointing, what you're doing, and how much damage even an air rifle could do. So we'll finish with that. Oh, I do want to mention that tomorrow at 5 o'clock, we're going to do a little roundtable discussion. Talk to the sheriff, and actually, Sheriff Armijo, during the exact time of that shooting, was doing active shooter training at the Socorro Co-op. So he does those trainings. I met with one of the school board members, Tara Jaramillo, wants to sit in on this. I talked to Athena at the compliance office. She suggested that I talk to Scope and try to get somebody from there because they're doing the training in the schools.
Yeah.
So I'm going to reach out to them today. We're going to try to put this together by tomorrow at 5 p.m. So hopefully we'll have another vocal eval at 5 p.m. concerning this gun violence and the tragedy in Texas. So I think enough said about that today. Now I want to get to my guests. I want to thank you, Zach, for kind of veering off with me. But let's hear a little bit about Zach Quintero. You mentioned you're from southern New Mexico.
Yes, sir.
And you say that kind of And our listeners might think, oh, that's one thing. But I think that's important because most of these state elected officials are from Santa Fe or Albuquerque, and now we have a very viable candidate that's from south of I-40. So talk about that with me and talk about your family and your history a little bit.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. So I'm a proud son of southern New Mexico from the Hatch Valley area, from Mesilla. So my mom, on my mom's side, 1 out of 12. My dad, 1 out of 9. I grew up with a public school teacher and a plumber. So I like to say I know how to listen well and I know how to deal with crap. So I'm a hard worker. And, one of the values I feel that we have as southern New Mexicans, in particular, is we have to scrap. We have to work maybe 4 or 5 times as hard because a lot of the resources aren't just there for us. And we got to make do with what we have. And for me, that really means making sure that regardless of zip code, regardless of background, here in New Mexico, you should have access to healthcare. You should have access to fair and equal funding for your education systems. You should have access to the same infrastructure money and not be deprioritized because you're in southern New Mexico. And it means you should have a fighter you can trust to hold powerful interests accountable in the private and public sector. That's what I had to do as the federal ombudsman. My job was to investigate abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation for our veterans, our seniors, and our adults with disabilities. I did that during the height of the pandemic. So my job was to help protect people's medical rights and make sure they weren't being ripped off. And I'm looking to bring that same kind of passion to the Office of the State Auditor. But my personal family is, a proud Latino family, hard workers, and first in my family to go to law school and graduate and everything. And, still get the calls at 3 a.m. Hey, Mijo, I was thinking about doing this. What do you think? Because nobody else has the legal background in my family. And having that kind of community, having that support network and system is personal for me. I decided to run for this office because of both personal and professional reasons. The personal reason is because my grandfather was my hero and he's a World War II veteran. And I saw his medical dignity get stripped away from him in a predatory healthcare scam. And I never forgot that financial pain that landed on my family. And I also noticed he was treated differently because he spoke Spanish. I was treated differently. How my tias and tios were as well. And this is something I feel that we could have a lot more support in southern New Mexico, making sure things are equitable and fair, and that the state government of New Mexico is responsive to every corner, regardless of zip code.
So you mentioned a few things that you talked about the veterans, you talked about disabilities. Mm-hmm. Now, the state auditor's office is kind of an obscure office to most voters.
Nerd of the nerd position.
Exactly. So, but you mentioned the veterans. Right. Most families have veterans within the family. Absolutely. So it would concern them. You mentioned about everybody getting fair and equal education. Right. To me, that's important. So we could talk a little bit about how the state auditor would affect education. And I know I'm struggling with that. Mm-hmm. I'm a very strong advocate of kids with disabilities. Yes. And the issues with special ed. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues I've had is that disbursement of resources to special ed is not cut and dry throughout the state. Right. How would the state auditor be able to make sure that the funding for education goes where it needs to go? Because there are certain laws that are passed for certain parts of education, but when it gets thrown into a general fund, what can the state auditor do to help oversee that?
Yeah, so let's start with its legal powers, and then we'll talk about how it directly can involve a specific area. So the legal power, it's a constitutional executive office within the state government that is tasked with 2 things now. The first is protecting the people's finances by investigating corruption, financial conflicts of interest, and any illegal transactions that are done with the public's money, right? And then the second part is the expanded role it has now, which is investigating predatory healthcare scams and making sure people aren't taken advantage of. So 2 main functions this office serves. But for the education component, very directly, what it's allowed to do, what I would be allowed to do, is look at the total spending in education and within special education, right? And ask myself the following questions. Let's look zip code by zip code, school district by school district. What's the class population size? It's mirrored to another class, maybe in northern or southwest New Mexico or southeast New Mexico. But those classes are getting more funding. Why? Okay, I just want to know why. Do they have more kids that need specialized training and services? If the answer is no, right, or if it's a back delay, it's something that hasn't been dispersed and they've been waiting years, then I want to know why there's favoritism going on. I want to be able to issue that publicly and say, like, look, there should be equal access to this funds and this amount of funding when it comes to our services for our kids. And I'm allowed to follow up with that by having specific audits for special education and look at the performance of those funds and ask if it's actually going to the classroom. There's some projects where they say, yeah, hey, this is for the kids, this is for education, but it's actually just for a contractor that's walking away with a bunch of money. Mm-hmm. And that's where I want to make sure we protect the taxpayers from fraud, abuse, and neglect.
And one of the things that I've thought is that, I was pretty active in creating the state ombud position for special ed. Mm-hmm. I was on the phone with Michelle Tregemmo, as a matter of fact, when you mm-hmm. drove up. And one of the things I was telling her is that we don't always have to go after the bad school districts or the problems.
Right.
We could also spend a little bit of time recognizing those school districts that are doing it right.
Right.
And try to create a model from that. Sure. And maybe the state auditor's office could do the same thing. Hey, we went into this school district, we went over their books, everything was great. We're going to give them a thumbs up and some kind of recognition. I think that doesn't happen enough in government, and maybe sure. It needs to, so that it's not always, oh, here they come again, trying to find something. Sometimes you can say, hey, we're bringing you this little recognition saying you're a model, and would you sure. consider, doing some workshops with us or something right. to help further other school districts in the state. And I think that's something that I think more of our government officials might want to recognize, sure. because when I was an elected official, I opened my little handbook I got at BIPO, Better Informed Public Officers, and the first sentence was that you're an advocate for the community.
Right.
No matter what elected office you have, you're advocating for the community. Now, you also mentioned about public funding and how it's being spent.
Yes.
Now, you could also monitor what's happening within county offices, commissions, city, municipal entities.
All
correct?
Public spending, except if it's just federal to federal. I can't investigate without a written agreement with the U.S. Attorney or the federal government or maybe tribe or Pueblo Nation or tribe. But I can investigate any federal and state funds that are intermingled, dispersed through county, local, and state entities as well.
So I know there's been, like if we tie this in with what's gone on in the last couple of years with elections.
Yeah.
And some commissioners saying, hey, we're going to come in here and we're going to use the public money
right.
to redo canvassing or recounts or stuff like
sure.
that.
Yeah.
Is somebody accountable for that
Absolutely.
that action, or do they just get away with doing it?
No, they don't get away with doing it. In fact, that triggers an immediate investigation if somebody's trying to use the public's funds for political purposes. Mm-hmm. And making sure that we have that kind of accountability and follow through is a core part of my plan, an anti-corruption plan. You see a lot of these audit the vote folks,
yep.
right? Okay, well, what does that really mean? That means they want to hire a third-party contractor to come in with state or county resources, mind you, right? And pay them with our taxpayer money to investigate something that is completely frivolous, right? That's the definition of fraud to me.
Yep.
So I'm able to investigate the people that pull that audit together, the people that are expending that money, and be able to have the people that disperse that money pay it back, right? The actual people that money would be going to.
So whatever hours the county clerk's office puts in,
yeah,
they better get paid because they're not doing that for free.
Exactly. And also if it requires judicial resources, like if they take it to the courts, right, mm-hmm. and expend state or county resources to fight these lawsuits in the court, I expect them to pay for those hours as well. I expect them to pay for the full consequences of the serious claim they're making, which is that there's an element of fraud, right? But if they're the ones creating the fraud, yeah, a lot more direct action from our office at that stage.
So I think we're starting to bring up some issues or circumstances that the voters would want to talk more about.
Sure.
Now, another thing is you mentioned how our elderly are being treated. I sit on the governor's board for the Developmental Disabilities Council, and we oversee the guardianship program.
Yep.
Now, that's a place that has gotten in trouble in the past with like exploitation,
Yep.
what some of these healthcare providers are doing. Talk a little bit about what the auditor's office could do in those cases of exploitation, especially
Sure.
for the elderly.
Yeah, so this is the one that's really close to my heart because again, my grandfather went through that system where his VA benefits were stolen from him and his medical rights were stripped away. The state auditor has three main functions in investigating predatory healthcare scams as well as predatory guardianships. The first is to work with the courts because when you are finding yourself in a situation where you don't have legal rights, the court is making the decision for you to work with either an attorney or a third-party company to manage your rights, to manage your money, to manage your medical benefits, to manage your pain medication. All of it's dependent upon this other person taking care of you. My job would be to make sure it's not a bad person, making sure that person's not stealing money from you, and taking anonymous tips or taking tips from the court and saying, okay, we can do a forensic investigation and look at the finances. Are you actually paying for the medical benefits that are supposed to go for this person? Are you paying for the prescriptions? Are they timely? Are they meeting the standard of care that is expected with this person's specific needs? If not, that guardian or that company is committing fraud. They're billing for services that are not rendered. That's the way that I identify fraud.
So like assisted living
Yep.
programs and stuff like that, you would be able to oversee. Now, another area in healthcare that's really boomed in New Mexico,
Sure.
and I think the main reason is because there's not enough of those assisted living facilities or medical facilities, is home health care.
Absolutely.
You know, that's huge all over the place. It's one of the big businesses here in Socorro that's really helped get a lot more jobs in place. But what it's helped to do is help to facilitate healthcare for those people that stay home.
Right.
You know, my mom would be one of them. I'm going to stay in my house. You know, that's an
Right.
old, I think, Hispanic tradition that,
Sure.
that they don't believe in getting put in a home. They're going to stay here.
Yeah.
But for those, they get the opportunity to have a family member or anybody come in and oversee that.
Right.
But you could also make sure that that's on the up and up.
Absolutely. If it's involving public funds, right, or any state resources, involving their medical benefits, involving timeliness of deliveries and things like that, that overlaps with us because it involves the public's interest, and that's how I classify this. This is truly an office for the people. If you look at it, it's a great equalizer to make sure everybody's health care is protected, that their rights are being protected, and also that our taxpayer money isn't being abused or handed with corrupt hands.
And I think that's important because that I don't think is going away very, very soon. Now the other thing you talked here from the Hatch Valley,
Yeah.
second best chili in New Mexico.
That's an ongoing, and I'm gonna have an annual chili contest. I promise you. If elected state auditor, knock on wood, because we're raised by superstitious people.
You know, we talked about Commissioner Glenn Duggins. He started that 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have, I think, the third annual chili contest.
The Cruces
this fall.
Socorro chili contest.
It's been real huge. It happens at the fairgrounds just down the street. So
Right.
I'll invite you to that, and you could see what I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
But with that precious commodity, I think we have in New Mexico, the big issue there is water.
Absolutely.
You know, how can the state auditor get involved with how the water is dispensed, not just in New Mexico, but with the issue that we have to share with Texas as well. Is there any
Sure.
way that happens, that the state auditor gets involved with stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, just from the cultural element, I think we should acknowledge just the importance of agriculture here in southern New Mexico, and that we feed most of New Mexico.
Yeah.
That's point one. Point number two is, the challenge we're facing for farmers, for the agricultural small business and family businesses that have sustained this state in agriculture. They're facing an unprecedented challenge. They're now pumping groundwater in order to maintain their chili fields, which means they only have a short table of lifespan before those wells, before those, watersheds go completely dry. And what will we do then? That's what we got to ask ourselves. That's going to be the challenge that we need to rally around from every corner of New Mexico, because we identify from every corner of the state with our chili.
Yeah.
That's the one thing we all share with when it comes to, we can all agree on one thing. Maybe on like who has the best for sure, but that we all like it, we can agree. And that we want it.
We need to keep it.
And we need to keep it, absolutely. So I just want to make those first 2 points. State Auditor's Office involves in the following way. I can look at acequias associations, I can look at water co-ops, and be able to help them with financial compliance, to have timeliness reports, rather than hit them with a $75,000 fee where their entire budget gets affected. And they won't have resources to get a quick tractor fix to help maintain the arroyos or the ditches or the acequias waterways. So I can help them on the practical pieces of that to help immediately in real time. The long-term parts that I can help with is looking again through that lens of equity on whether or not things are being distributed fairly, and also what Texas is trying to do when they're trying to siphon away our water. I want to be able to do legal injunctions for water rights, in partnership with the Attorney General's office, to be able to keep our water here and keep our systems completely replenished, because it is our water. And it's my legal opinion, but I know some folks don't agree with me on that. But I also believe that we can have equity when it comes to how that water and how the infrastructure to maintaining and preserving that water is dispersed. Making sure we look zip code by zip code, acequia association by acequia association. How are things being distributed? Do we need more funding from the federal billions of dollars coming in? Because there's going to be billions coming in. We need to make sure it gets to all the communities in immediate need right now. And we need to make sure that's done fairly and not going to a specialized private contractor and then not ending up in the community. That's where I come in, to make sure I track that money from point A to point B to protect the people's finances.
So you mentioned a little bit about the water, and then it brought to mind that New Mexico Tech Geology Department is a big component of the conversation about what's going on with water throughout New Mexico. And, New Mexico Tech is kind of it's the heartbeat of Socorro, I think, because it employs so many people, it educates so many people, both here and from abroad. But the product that comes out of there, the technology, the water mining issues is so important. How would the state auditor's office be able to help protect New Mexico Tech and other schools of higher education throughout the state? Where do we get involved there?
Sure. So, I've thought about this ever since I was looking at this office critically and looking at it through the long-term lens of like the challenge that I just described we're going to face, which is ultimate water shortage. And southern New Mexico is going to be the first one to feel it. And we're going to be the first ones to probably have migration, sadly, from different parts and different corners of southern New Mexico come further up north for closer access to water. Truly, we're in that kind of dire straits. So what I want to do is have our research education institutions designated as a critical safety spot. And what do I mean by that? If we have a geology department there that's mapping out the entire resources of water systems throughout the state of New Mexico, that is a state safety issue. They are looking out for the betterment and longevity of our people. I want to make sure I protect that kind of research and that kind of funding. And I want to make sure they're partnered with folks back in my area at NMSU, right? We're desalination experts. We work with the Israeli government in real time for desalination techniques, and we can cross-collaborate on different projects. And if we need resources to get that done for the safety of New Mexico, to maintain and protect the chili, to maintain our population, to be able to be sure that people live with dignity and access to water, then we got to get it done. We got to designate it as that. And I can do that as state auditor by connecting these two institutions, pointing to where the available funding is, pulling in federal funding, and then again, making sure I follow that money closely to ensure it goes to the projects they're working on together, rather than somebody saying they're going to do something and then it never gets done.
So, good answer. I like that. Now, we talked a little bit about this before we went on the air, and a little bit now. The other, I think, precious commodity we have in New Mexico is our public lands.
Yes.
You know, our forests, our hunting lands, you know, that are protected, game and fish.
Right.
You know, so where does the state auditor fit in making sure that our public lands that are not just public, but are indigenous people that have sacred property
Absolutely.
throughout New Mexico? Does the auditor get involved in any of that at all? And I'm sure they do.
Yes, so there's some overlap, and I see an expanded role here, actually. There's an opportunity here to create more accountability and access to state government. And here's what I mean by that. I want to have an environmental annual audit of all public lands and how many extractions are happening on public lands, water contaminations, venting and flarings, unplugged wells, and put the total cost of that transparent to our taxpayers and say, this is how much it's costing us to clean up pollution, or this is how many unplugged wells there are, this is how much damage is happening. Here's all our remediation efforts, and then make that comparison side by side, right? So they can look at it in real time. And that way we hold ourselves accountable as government, but also we hold polluters accountable. We hold people who have desecrated those lands accountable, and make sure they're not walking out and leaving this state holding the bag. As for our pueblos, nations, and tribes, you know, this is one of the specialized projects I've been focusing on since day one, which is working with tribal communities early on to track education, healthcare, and economic development funds from the federal government that pass through the state government that are promised for tribal use, but somehow don't end up there, right?
Yeah.
They run into that situation all the time.
We see that here at the Alamo Reservation. They get fractions of what they're promised from,
Exactly.
from the federal government.
That's what I'm fighting to make sure. I can track that money and show them where it's at with the state in real time, in which accounts, what's maybe holding up the process, right? And then helping them navigate that. But what requires that for me to be able to engage in that dialogue is formal consultation and a legal memorandum of understanding, since they're federally designated. So because it's federal money promised for federal land or federal, you know, folks, I have to be able to have agreement from that party before I'm allowed to get involved. But if it's involving the state government like that and how they distribute funds, I can get involved right then and there, and then let them know in real time,
Wow.
Here's how it's going. Here's where your money's supposed to be at, and here's where it's at right now.
So, I think finally the last thing I want to talk about is that it's in many of the campaign commercials right now, is oil and gas versus renewable, and what's happening with that. You know, we know that the oil and gas industry really affects global warming and what's happening with our environment.
Yes.
But, you know, some of the stuff with renewable energy is already being produced here, but used somewhere else.
Yes.
That was concerning to me when I heard the Sunzia project, and that started back in 2006 when I was a county assessor, because I remember in those conversations, and I was like, so you're telling me that none of this energy is going to be used here, you know? But where does the auditor get involved with those conversations? That's a toughie.
Oh, it absolutely is. And you know, that would normally fall under the Attorney General's purview in most circumstances, because when you're trying to do a legal injunction against a company that's maybe siphoning away energy, right, they can get involved that way. But here's where I can get involved. If it involves county or local or state resources overlapping with a private entity, because there's what we call regulated monopolies, right? Yeah. Then I'm able to look at their books. I'm able to go in and say, okay, X percentage of this energy is required to go here. Are you meeting that standard? Are you actually following through on that specific contract performance that you have agreed to? Or if we're looking at the longer, like bigger argument, why isn't that energy staying here in New Mexico? I can do an economic report annually and saying, here's how much energy is leaving the state of New Mexico from renewable energy. Here's how much we're keeping. There's a huge gap here. Here's the dollar cost to us, and here's our energy prices for doing that. And that will cause both state legislators and the executive branch to create tighter restrictions to keep that energy here in New Mexico and keep it here for our people.
And if nothing else, it just creates transparency.
Yeah.
So that the voters know what's happening.
Absolutely.
And I think without that, they just have to assume. And we know what assume means, but and I think clarity is the most important thing in any elected office. You know, that we're not hiding nothing, and the auditor can bring the most fiscal clarity to almost any situation we've talked about so far.
Sure. When there's public money involved and the waters are muddy, my job is to clear it completely so we see what we're looking at in real time.
So, Zach, is there anything else you want to add? I mean, I went through almost everything I was thinking about talking here. If I missed anything, now's your chance.
No, totally. And I'm very grateful to both of you on the radio station for hosting me today. Truly, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to make sure we send both more candidates here so the people of Socorro know that people in state government are engaged in their issues and their concerns and their needs. Because like I've been running on, every corner of the state is personal and matters. And Southern New Mexico, we have a chance here to have somebody in the executive branch who can make sure that things are not only fair but transparent and that things are equitable. And so I just ask you to check out my website, www.zq4nm.com, and remind you that the election is June 7th. I do not have a Republican opponent. So that means the next state auditor will be decided
on
June 7th.
Wow.
You want that person to be a Southern New Mexican. I know you do, because I do. So
There's New Mexico south of the I-40. I didn't know that.
yes, there is, very much so.
Wonderful.
It's where the chili's hot.
So then we'll send out a shout out to your opponent and all the other candidates.
Yeah.
We've done pretty good this election cycle, I think, Reese, for the little program we have here, getting people to come in and talk to us. So.
Yeah. If I may, just quickly,
Absolutely.
One last thing. Some folks have stated different views on what's needed in this office. The last 3 state auditors all had a background in law, investigations, or in economics. I have 2 degrees in economics. I'm a graduate of UNM School of Law, and I'm the only candidate in this race that has investigated abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation in healthcare. That's what we need. That's what we deserve in this office. Relevant experience and trust. I'm endorsed by Senator Martin Heinrich, Planned Parenthood Votes New Mexico, the Environmental Justice Caucus, and over 87 Democratic leaders, including leaders here in Socorro County. So
That's quite an endorsement.
Well, there you have it, Reese. With that, we'll put an end to this edition of Vocals with Val, and join us tomorrow at 5 o'clock for our special talk about the shooting in Texas and what's being done in Socorro to help prevent stuff like that.
Well, cool. So Valentin and Aya, thanks for a great interview today with Zach Quintero. Really appreciate you guys, Zach, coming into our little studio here in the Socorro, because there is media in southern New Mexico.
Absolutely.
And we do our best here, and Val, you did a great job. So thank you. I learned a lot. I hope our listeners did as well. Thanks for all of you listening online on Rio Grande Valley Radio. We're going to return to our country programming. Right now, we're going to sign off, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Have a great day. Be safe out there, and be kind and gentle to one another. We definitely need it. Take care.
Gracias.